Vice Chair Greenman, I'll ask you if you may to move House File 3796 to bring that before us.
So moved.
Thank you. And then also, Representative Jones, you've got a DE2 amendment you'd like to be offered, yes?
Yes, I'd like to move the DE.
Yeah, you may not move it, unfortunately.
I may not move it. Good.
Vice Chair Greenman may, though, if you're willing to do that again, Madam Vice Chair.
So moved.
Thank you. And Representative Jones, if you can just maybe tell us briefly about the bill and about the DE2 before we vote on that. Just briefly, before we adopt the DE2, we probably should know what the bill does and so what the DE2 does briefly.
Yes, so thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Yeah, this bill is basically giving employees the right to sit, a reasonable expectation of that where it is suitable. And the DE2 is clarifying some language. We had some back and forth with the Department of Labor and Industry, so they helped us kind of tighten up the bill in some ways, and then also providing a penalty for violations of this.
Thank you so much. And members, I'll note, my plan is to lay over House File 3796, not to go to a vote today. I will do the author the courtesy of amending the bill in the way she wishes. So we'll just see if there's discussion or questions. And if not, I'll ask all in favor of approval of the DE2 amendment, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that motion passes. And so if you can say anything further you wish about House File 3796 as amended, Representative Jones.
Yes, thank you again, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I really appreciate the opportunity to present this bill, House File 3796, to you today. I want to start with a question. What are you physically doing right now? Yes, you're breathing, hopefully. You're also probably reading, writing, and importantly, you are sitting. Can you imagine going through these committees standing the whole time? Or even, especially a floor session that goes way into the evening, standing the whole time? I'm bringing forward this bill, which would provide employees in Minnesota a reasonable and suitable expectation to be able to sit during the job. This came before me from constituents in my district who work at a museum. Their roles involve explaining exhibits to patrons. And quite frankly, it's not unlike some of the roles that our Gold Ties provide. They spend the majority of their time here at the Capitol, generally standing or being in one place for long periods of time, observing, answering questions, or proactively providing information to people around them near their post. So our Gold Ties, to my knowledge, have never been denied access to a stool or a chair. In fact, there are often, their stools provided right there with those gold ribbons around them specifically designated for them. So being required to stand for long periods of time without an opportunity to sit can actually have negative health consequences. According to a meta-analysis published by NIH's National Library of Medicine, prolonged standing at work has been shown to be associated with a number of potential serious health outcomes, such as lower back and leg pain, cardiovascular outcomes, fatigue, discomfort, and pregnancy-related health outcomes. While this bill was inspired by constituents, I personally see the need of this type of protection as someone who just 3.5 weeks ago was pregnant. People who are pregnant have jobs and are very capable of doing their jobs, particularly when reasonable accommodations like a stool, a bench, or a chair is provided. This bill recognizes that not all roles have the opportunity to sit at all times. When I worked at Subway, for example, assembling sandwiches required me to work down the table, first starting at the bread, and then the meat and cheese, and then the veggies, and then going down the table to ring up the customer. But this is a practical bill that supports Minnesota workers, giving them the opportunity to sit where it is reasonable and when it is reasonable, just as we have here to be able to do our jobs. Also, as I had mentioned earlier, this bill has been developed in consultation with DLI, and I also have a testifier. So thank you so much for your consideration.
Thank you, Representative Jones. So it looks like your first testifier is up there. If you can please identify yourself and proceed with your testimony. And I'm going to ask folks if you can keep it to just a couple minutes, that would be good. Please proceed.
Good morning, Chair Pinto, Co-Chair Macklin, and others of the committee. For the record, I'm Michelle Mazer, the former president of Walker Worker Union. I worked at the Walker Art Center for over 3.5 years, where I was elected union president 3 times. I'm a lifelong resident of Minnesota, and I'm here today in strong support of House File 3796, and I want to thank Representative Jones for carrying this legislation. I worked in visitor experience, the same department as gallery assistant assistants, or abbreviation, GAs. In a museum setting, they're commonly referred to as guards, but they answer your questions and preserve the artwork by reminding us of the gallery rules. In late 2023, Walker enacted several new policies without notifying the union, which seemed to focus on micromanaging our appearance of professionalism on the floor. It was when workers were told that they would need a doctor's note to continue using a stool or else they would have to stand. That's when we asked to meet with the employer to hear why this was so important. We'd been doing our jobs perfectly well when we had the choice to sit down from time to time. When we meet, they claimed that this wasn't a new policy, but that workers had never been allowed to use the stools, which was easily disproved because there's gallery assistants who've worked there for 22 years at that point. Still, they maintained that we couldn't, claiming one anonymous complaint that they never produced. We stand on Italian terrazzo floors made up of the hardest flooring materials, which is marble and granite, certainly less forgiving than concrete. And so when a GA was found sitting, they were escorted off the premises by security, even though they had submitted a doctor's note. So shortly after, we had an entire campaign around getting the stools back. We gathered over 600 signatures on our petition. We wrote a letter to the museum director signed by a majority of our bargaining unit. We handed over 50 postcards from union members to the head of education detailing their experiences. Patrons filled out comment cards urging Walker to allow their staff seating. We tabled in the sculpture gardens. Artists featured in the Walker reached out to offer support. One artist reached out after having just built cushioned benches as functional art pieces for the galleries, and they had them pointedly described on the plaque as being, quote, available for all to use. The overwhelming response to our campaign was, this is silly, just let them sit. We just recently closed up our contract, but seating was not something the employer would budge on, and we have 4 more years of this contract. We aren't coming to the legislature on a whim. We've done everything to address this on and away from the table. Also, forcing us to stand does cause actual health problems. NIOSH conducted studies that consistently reported increased reports of muscle pain, back pain, cardiovascular problems, and poor pregnancy outcomes. Finally, I'll note that we arrived here because there is precedent for this. Suitable seating was the law in Minnesota in 1887, and it remained in effect for 80 years. It only referred to women, which is probably why it was repealed. Meanwhile, other states like Wisconsin just eliminated the gendered language. Making this change to Minnesota statute would not make us a national outlier. And to quote the old law, the goal to, quote, permit the use of such seats by such employees to such an extent as may be reasonable for their preservation of their health, end quote, is a goal that should ring true for all today. Thank you for considering House File 3796. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much. Thanks for being here and for your testimony. I'm going to ask the next 2 testifiers if you can come up, Lauren Schothorst and John, I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name, sir, but Beshi. And then there'll be one more testifier after that. I think, Ms. Schothorst, I think you're up first, and so once you get settled in, if you can please identify yourself and proceed. And again, with both of you can keep it to just a couple minutes. Ms. Schothorst.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Lauren Schothorst. I'm the Director of Workplace Management and Workforce Development Policy for the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, a statewide business organization representing 6,300 businesses and over 500,000 employees across the state. A majority of our members are small and mid-sized businesses. The Chamber appreciates the opportunity to raise a few questions about House File 3796, a seemingly simple piece of legislation requiring employers to provide seating for employees that might not be so simple to comply with as drafted. We have some fundamental definitional questions or scenarios to try and get a better sense of, as language that is up for interpretation can lead to litigation risks and unnecessarily subject a business to penalties if the employer doesn't guess correctly. What does the nature of the work reasonably permits the use of seats mean? It does not say when chairs are reasonably permitted and when it does not. Does this apply to the assembly line worker? Does this apply to seats at a packing line? Placing chairs where workers need to move could create obstructions to work, safety, and possible OSHA situations. How is that to be accounted for? Would nurses be legally entitled to sit in patient rooms while making rounds? Is an employer supposed to provide an employee with a chair while stocking lower shelves? Does a fast food employer have to install seating in the line preparing food directly for customers? Who determines what is considered an adequate number of seats, and what does reasonable proximity mean? Also, what does per violation mean? Is that for each employee, for each day of employment, per each chair, or per each not chair? in each possible discrepancy over the interpretation of these requirements. The point of the bill seems to be to allow workers to work while seated, but as drafted can be confusing. Reasonable people can have a legitimate disagreement on what is reasonable. Placing a penalty on employers for not complying with a vague statute is inherently a violation of due process. As we shared in the Senate, this bill introduces a vague but potentially consequential new requirement on employers of all sizes and industries. As a result, we ask that the committee continue to work on the language before advancing it. Thank you for the opportunity to raise these questions and issues of concern about the bill today.
Thank you, Ms. Schothorst. Yes, and to confirm, the plan, in fact, is to continue it, to lay it over today and have further discussions, but thank you. Mr. Beshe, welcome to you, and please identify yourself and proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Pinto, members of the committee. My name is John Beshe. I'm the State Director for the National Federation of Independent Business in Minnesota. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to provide comments in opposition to House File 3796. Just for context, NFIB represents about 10,000 small and independently owned businesses throughout Minnesota, and our members span every industry and serve local communities throughout Minnesota. NFIB opposes this bill, which requires employers to provide suitable seating for employees and to permit the use of those seats when the nature of the work reasonably permits. First and foremost, we do not believe that it is necessary to create a new state law to address this. Small businesses are already grappling with a growing list of workplace mandates, and we don't believe that the legislature needs to involve itself in every single workplace situation. With that said, we do have some specific aspects of this bill that cause particular concern and give rise to additional questions. Small businesses often operate in tight spaces that simply make it impracticable to maintain an adequate number of seats in reasonable proximity to the work area. This can be especially true in certain industries such as retail, food service, and hospitality. Depending on the workplace, small business owners could be forced to reconfigure their workspace and purchase additional equipment, all things that come with a cost that is difficult for small businesses to absorb. We are also concerned that this bill introduces some highly subjective concepts, such as maintaining an adequate number of seats and ensuring that such seating is located in reasonable proximity to the work area. Again, depending on the workplace, what constitutes reasonable proximity could vary depending on the perspective of the employee and employer. What is reasonable proximity for one employee may not be reasonable proximity for another. Similarly, what constitutes an adequate number of seats is vague and could be very much open to interpretation. For a small business owner without a dedicated HR or legal department, the subjectiveness of this requirement will make it nearly impossible to know whether they are truly compliant. Finally, this bill includes new punitive measures for failure to comply, which exposes small businesses to even more penalties and fines, even in instances where they may have acted in good faith. This is especially concerning considering the subjectiveness of some of the requirements that I previously mentioned. I want to thank you all again for the opportunity to provide comments, and we respectfully ask that you oppose this bill. I understand that it's being laid over, but those are our comments regarding the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Beshe. Yeah, thank you for being here. Thanks for your testimony. And I'll ask, Bernie Hess had also signed up to testify. I ask you to make your way up. And then please identify yourself once you get settled in, and a reminder asking folks to keep it relatively short here. Mr. Hess, a pleasure.
Chair Pinto, I am Bernie Hess from the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. I did work in a grocery store for 20 years, or I was employed there, as some people would say. 5 quick points on why we support this bill. One, ergonomically, I think it makes sense to move this forward, especially for cashiers. I look to Aldi's, which is a grocer that has its clerks that sit. They do up to 1,000 scans an hour when they're checking people out. So it adds to the efficiency of running a grocery store. We believe it also eliminates or reduces injuries, which translates into worker comp costs, which I think is smart. It also eliminates or reduces ADA complaints or requests for that. And in closing, remember, when you walk into a grocery store, nothing works without clerks. So if you have any questions, be happy to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Hess. We'll see if, thank you so much. We'll see if there's anybody else from the public wish to testify, and not seeing anyone to close testimony. Representative Schultz, we'll go to you first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question would be for the Department of Labor and Industry, if they could come to the table.
We'll ask. I'm pretty sure that we've got Mr. more in the room, so he'll make his way on up. Or maybe a couple folks. And whoever will be answering, once you get settled in, if you can please identify yourself and then ask you to identify yourself, and then we'll go back to Representative Schultz to ask the question. Okay,
I'm Josiah Moore, Legislative Director at Department of Labor and Industry.
okay.
And I'm Jessica Gross. I'm the Director of the Labor Standards Division at DLI.
Thank you so much, Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To the department, recent changes to the ergonomic statutes in 2023 and 2024 have been put into place, and I assume, given where this is going to be cited in state statute, that this is related to that conversation. I'm just curious if you could, number one, start with how has it been going at your enforcement of the ergonomic statutes?
And Mr. Moore?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Schultz, for the question. Just to clarify, the DE today moved this out of OSHA. So when it came before the committee today, it was in 182, which is where OSHA and that ergonomic statute lives. But today's amendment moved it to Chapter 181, which is enforced by our Division of Labor Standards. So the bill, the enforcement of the bill wouldn't relate to enforcement of the ergonomics standard.
Looks like they anticipated your question. Representative Schultz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, obviously the underlying, or the original bill was in that same area. But, so I'm really curious about how you would go about enforcing this, this new piece of policy.
Ms. Gross, perhaps, or Mr. Moore? Or, yeah, Ms. Gross, yeah? Or, I'm not sure which of you is going to answer that.
I can
Ms. Gross,
take it.
okay, please.
Thank you. So in terms of enforcing this, when we receive questions or complaints to the division, we usually handle them in a variety of manners. Sometimes we receive questions from employers and our employees, and we're just providing, we're responding to questions and providing technical assistance. At times when we receive a complaint, we also partake in something called the inform and educate process, which is basically we put the employer on notice of their obligations, their potential noncompliance with the law, and essentially work with them in a informal manner in order to help to bring the employer into compliance. We don't issue penalties when we go through the inform and educate process. If we were not successful in using the inform and educate process to bring an employer into compliance, then we may initiate an investigation in which we would speak with impacted employees, we would speak with the employer. Here we may, for example, we may consult with OSHA to help us come to a determination in terms of reasonableness, and then we would issue an order which could include penalties.
Representative Schultz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my general question is, are we going to be seeing a huge request for enforcement actions based upon what we know that is in current law and complaints that the department has received across the state?
Ms. Gross? You said,
I think that would be difficult to determine right now. I guess I can point to that this bill obviously would apply to all employees. So we do anticipate when we have a workplace standard that applies to all employees that certainly we would see an uptick in calls and complaints in relation to it.
Representative Schultz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and maybe this is for Representative Jones, but I'd really like to understand what a statewide impact is to this and to understand how frequent of an issue, this is not discrediting or saying that this isn't a challenge for some. I'm just curious if this is something that you see that has a truly statewide impact, and if it does, if it has a truly statewide impact, if it's impacting every employee or every employer in the state, I'm curious as to what amount of intensity we're going to see along these lines, and more information in that regard before we take this step to insert additional enforcement mechanisms from the government.
Thank you, Representative Schultz. And there will be, of course, more discussion on this before we be voting or addressing it. Representative Jones, comments regarding Representative Schultz's question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Schultz, for that question. I think especially because we're going to be kind of continuing to work on this, one of the things that comes to mind that we could continue investigating as this similar policies do exist in other states, we could take a look at that, and we could come back and have that discussion around potential level of complaints.
In particular, I guess I was going to bring this up later, but I heard the testifier talk about how this is the law in Wisconsin and other states as well, and was Minnesota law for, sounds like multiple decades. So that could be helpful insight as well to answer Representative Schultz's question. Okay, good. We'll see. Representative Schultz, yeah, something else?
Yeah, no, just in wrap up, Mr. Chair, you know, we want to have the information as to how many people this is impacting. We also want to know, like, how much of a burden is this going to be on the department? Certainly, if they're fielding calls left and right from every corner of the state, certainly I think that this would have a fiscal impact to the department, and that's where my questions were.
Yeah, no,
Thanks.
absolutely. Thank you, Representative Schultz. We'll see if anybody has anything else. Vice Chair Mecklen, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The department mentioned inform and educate, and then potentially if it goes on to penalties, but what does reasonable mean? I mean, what is what's too many, not enough? It doesn't really clarify. What's the legislative intent here? It's just not specifying what is required. Can they be hard plastic chairs? Do they have to be cushion chairs? If they're cushion chairs, can they be in a meatpacking plant? They have to be sanitized every day. What does reasonable mean? Because there's nothing that is clarifying that here.
Ms.
Somebody could answer that.
Yeah, I'm not, so Representative Jones, perhaps you're the right person to take it, or otherwise one of the testifiers. Okay, Representative Jones, we'll send it to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mecklen, for this question. Because we are trying to provide worker protection statewide, we wanted to make sure that we are encompassing all of that, because I think to your point that, you know, what is reasonable for a meatpacking plant is different from what's reasonable for a museum, and so that's why we wanted to give the discretion to the department.
Vice Chair Mecklen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we see this quite often where the discretion is left to the department, and then if it does run a bit away from where we intended, then of course there's no, it certainly wasn't your fault because you didn't design it that way, I guess, or the elected person can't be held accountable by their constituents. I'm trying to visualize if I'm like finishing a basement or building a deck, do I have to have chairs sitting out there? And then I got to take into account the soil conditions, because if it sinks and then tips over, now I got an OSHA issue. There's a lot of different things to be taken into account. But this sounds like it's stemmed out of a museum. Why are we not focusing on the museum that's not accommodating their employees, rather than trying to blanketly cover every employer with yet another mandate that may or may not fit into their small little kitchen, because greasy floors, tight spaces, as was mentioned by many, and then to leave it so openly vague to just say reasonable and let somebody else decide what reasonable means. That's my final comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks so much, Vice Chair Mecklen. I'm not, I think, not seeing anybody else. I'll send it to you, Representative Jones, to close and to respond to any of that. I'll note that I am interested in how this works in other states and the past Minnesota law. I'm getting information that it was repealed in the 1970s, so it's actually in place for a long time. So understanding how that works, and I may be able to just note that it's quite common in laws that we do use the word reasonable or reasonably, and then there's some case law that builds up to interpret that. But Representative Jones, closing on your bill.
Yeah, thank you all for the discussion, and I look forward to further conversation to hopefully include this going forward.
Yeah, and I assume, Representative Jones, you're very open to conversation with your colleagues as they kind of want to understand this better and provide input. Thank you. Well, thank you to you. Thank you to all the testifiers. With that, the chair lays over House File 3796 as amended.